Oftentimes I found that I knew more about their business than they did. I thought sales was like the devil's work, right? In my career, I have tended to not use the RFP. Most of them were just in an echo chamber saying that, but they didn't have a slice through. And at some point, he sort of went, whoa, these are harder questions than the analysts. We'll have third-party diligence basically by and large negotiated between MCP servers. And so if you can understand how these three financial statements tie together.
All right, well, welcome again, everybody. We're joined today by Matthew Sharp. He's the Chief Information Security Officer at Xactly. He's also co-author of the book, CISO Evolution. Thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So one of the things I'm always interested about, and your career has been a really interesting one in terms of starting out at Coalfire and then kind of going through a real journey to where you are now. Different phases of your career, sort of different skill sets, like when you start out as an individual contributor and then you go to sort of a manager, there's this moment where you're like, oh, wait, hang on a second, I've got to learn some new things. I'm wondering if you could kind of walk us through a little bit, like a couple of those epochs in particular, as you ended up making your way to the executive roles. What skills did you end up having to pick up that were shocking to you as a sort of like, I didn't realize that would actually be a thing I would have to learn?
Yeah. I mean, I came out of school computer electrical engineer. I was very technical. Like, if you look behind the screen, you can't see here is my diploma with a printed circuit board that I designed for my senior project, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So I was very technical. Went into pen testing and then transitioned into more audit-oriented work at Coalfire. And then I transitioned into a new role, actually for the money, probably at Fishnet, and found myself in a sales role, like a sales overlay. From there, I did some world travel and came back to that same role. I had a lot of opportunity to interact with a lot of senior executives during that period.
Okay.
Because we were selling services to most of the country's top firms, and then at that point, I think I was really convinced that I had more knowledge, frankly, than most of the CISOs that I was talking to when it came to the vendor landscape, for sure, because I was at Fishnet.
Oh, yeah.
And frankly, a lot of the disciplines, because I was selling very specialized disciplines across all of cyber, I think I had access to best practices and some of the top minds in industry in a way that a lot of CISOs just didn't have. And so I wanted to transition to an operator role out of consulting, and that was a big transition. And then obviously getting from the operator role into the sort of C-suite was probably the last transition. So those are the big transitions I think I see in my career. Man, I thought sales was like the devil's work, right? Until I got into it. And I learned a lot about influence and networking. I learned a lot about how important revenue is to drive the business. I learned a lot about negotiations. And I think all of those things have served me really well as I've kind of taken on more responsibility. I think taking a transition from the individual contributor role into more of a manager role was obviously a big transition. And I think part of that transition was sort of reinforced when I became a father. So I think that also changed about leadership. And then I got an MBA, and I think an MBA, like they take you through structured frameworks on leadership and different sort of mentalities. Is it traits-based or transformational or service or whatever? And I think those insights have informed my approach to leadership. And then I think the MBA also helped solidify the way that I articulate the value of cyber in the context of business.
So let me ask a question along that line, and specifically thinking about cyber with respect to business, because I have a lot of conversations at multiple layers in various organizations. And one of the things I'll watch, and I've been in these meetings where like you're in the meeting and there's a bunch of folks who are like ICs or mid-level doers, and then there's like an executive, and I listen and I'm like, the things you're talking about as a person who's hands on keyboard, and the thing your executive is talking about are just like, they just don't line up, right? And this frustration that everybody feels of like, if they would just understand.
Yeah.
If you were giving advice to a younger you, right, somebody who's coming up now, who's in cybersecurity, who's like in a position of doing the work, and you were to say like, okay, in order to ease your transition, upward in an organization or easier communication upward in an organization. What would you tell them about things that they would need to learn or things that they would need to do to make that easier?
Uh, I think this is interesting. So when I used to go to sell services, I would do effectively a profile on a business
Okay.
before I went in to talk to the CISOs. And oftentimes I found that I knew more about their business than they did. Like, how did they segment their revenues on their financial statements? A
Mhm.
lot of guys at that point, back in 2012, 2014, didn't know.
Mm.
I think that's probably still true for maybe a quarter of the folks in these significant roles.
Okay.
So I would say there's a book that we actually mentioned in my book that's called How to Measure or How to Read a Financial Statement by John
Okay.
Tracy.
Okay.
And it stitches together the three financial statements and how the different pieces, the different numbers play together in one beautiful graphic. And I think if you can understand how that works and you can understand how to read a 10K, then you can understand how to frame the conversation when you're talking to any executive.
Okay.
Um, and I think, yeah, I think then the next thing would be there's a difference between moral authority and formal authority. And at
Okay.
the end of the day, so moral authority, and if this is not a common term, like this is a thing out of the Seven Habits of Highly Effective People from Stephen Covey many
Yep.
years ago. And moral authority essentially says it's based on your character and how you've earned the ability to influence and people choose to follow you.
Okay.
And formal authority is assigned to you by your title or your,
Mhm.
your whatever. So I think moral authority is actually where true leadership takes place. And yeah, and so I would say the reality is it's more about influence than it is about dictates.
Mhm.
And that turns out to be true no matter how high up the ranks you go.
Yeah.
Like that's always true.
Yeah.
So those would be the things that I would probably focus on, you know.
Fascinating, and one of the things, so you mentioned, like, when you were first sort of like thinking about it, like sales, you were like, "Oh, it's the devil's work." But then you ended up doing it for a number of years and looks like learned a tremendous amount about how business actually operates and things like this. So as an experience, um, like, one question, like, are there any other lessons that were kind of surprising out of the sales experience that you would be like, "Hey, one thing you might not know about sales as a discipline," or one thing that you, like, kind of surprised you coming out of there?
That there's a book called Let's Get Real or Let's Not Play.
Okay.
And this book uh talks about aligning the buyer and seller uh incentives. And what turns out to be true as a person who's signing the check and choosing a technology or a person who's trying to sell is you both want the most efficient sales cycle
Mhm.
that exactly meets the buyer's needs. And the reason is, as a seller, if I perfectly meet your needs, you're successful, you're happy, and you buy again. And if it's done efficiently, I spend very little in my sales cycle to get you there. And as a buyer, of course, you don't want to spend like nobody likes the RFP process. Nobody likes the RFP process. And so I think in my career, I have tended to not use the RFP because in my experience as a seller, it watered down my ability to differentiate, and my key differentiators got lost in the mix. And so I
Okay.
don't tend to use the RFP. Um, and then I think the negotiation piece is pretty critical. Like if you understand the pressure that a seller is under, the complexity that they face, the even just the ability to give a seller like a transparent view. We're not closing this deal this quarter. Let's
Mhm.
push it to next quarter. That's a healthier forecast for you. Like they appreciate that stuff. And
Okay.
that goodwill comes back to you, I think, as a buyer. Yeah, I don't know. I think I struggled with networking
Okay.
um, um, until I found that networking wasn't about artificial relationships, but if you just put yourself in a curious mindset and believe that every person in the room had something to teach you, that you could learn at every event that you went. And
Okay.
and so that was they're subtle mind tricks, like the difference between this guy is here to take my money or swindle me,
Yeah.
or I'm here to make this artificial relationship so I can ask him for something some other point.
Mhm.
Like those mind shifts were pretty important for me in in order to feel comfortable in the role and not feel like I was doing the devil's work, like I
Yeah.
said. Yeah. So
Well, that I mean, so that one's I will say, as a CEO, I spend a lot of time, networking, and I will tell you, I'm an introvert. The wall of books behind you should tell you that, like, I would much prefer read a book than talk to people. One of the things that I've had to do as well is get better at that networking, and, like, there are a few things that I've done, and one of them, I didn't put it in the word. I think you did a much better job of sort of like, like crystallizing it, but this idea of going into a networking event and being like, "I'm interested in learning about the people who are in this room." Right?
yeah,
For no other reason than to learn about them, right? Like, hey, where, like, and I have a few sort of stock things and stock approaches that make it significantly more comfortable. And as long as I can kind of keep that front of mind, while I still sometimes find it exhausting, I get a lot out of it. You meet such interesting people. So there is that like real benefit of like everybody's there trying to, sort of like, find each other in that thing. So early on in your career, early-ish on in your career, you took a bit of a sabbatical and you ended up having a tremendous sort of journey across the world, a trek. He went to the base camp of Everest, like teaching English, like a whole bunch of different stuff. I'm curious, can you tell me a little bit about one, like what set you off on the journey? Two, like it sounds transformational. Like what did you do? And like did you come out of it a different person? What did you learn along the way?
hmm. Yeah. It was transformational. It was intended to pursue growth. So I think at that point I had gone through college. I had been through a couple of roles and I was learning a lot, and but I recognized that things needed to be broader than intellectual. And so we set out with this concept of body, mind, heart, and spirit. And the idea was to utilize adventure travel to really stretch the limits of those core concepts. And
Okay.
so, like, body was the trek, right? A big trek. Mind was to try and attempt to learn Mandarin Chinese. Heart was doing some meaningful volunteer and acts of service, and spirit was you could say the Camino de Santiago, or you could say yoga teacher training.
Okay.
Um, and so and then we added a couple of other things in there because we had the time, and at that point we had, I mean, the few years leading into that, we sold everything, and we lived in a double wide. We
Okay.
split a double wide with a family member. So I think I was probably making more money at that point than I had in any point in my career, and I think our monthly expenses were like $400 a month.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it was a big opportunity for us to stock this money, and we just we set out. I mean, I think it's also fair. Maybe my uh, I had done a lot of travel for work,
Okay.
and put a lot of strain on my relationship, on my marriage, and so there was also probably, in truth, a bit of a reset for my marriage at that point.
Mhm.
Um, and the big lessons were, I mean, there were a ton of lessons. Like, we got to see different people in different cultures. We got to experience different mindsets.
Mhm.
So I got to study and see firsthand, like, what does a business meeting look like in China? And I got to see maybe firsthand what does a wedding look like in India? And I got to see, we got invited to people's homes to make pierogies in um, a couple of different countries in Eastern Europe. And so, by the time I had come back, like, in cyber, you spend so much time saying the East is like, you demonizing the East, right? Like, who are the biggest
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
players in cyber? It's always the Russians and the Chinese, right?
Yeah.
And so I spent time in those countries and started to empathize with things like uh, economic economically challenged environments, and the idea that, like, if I was in one of these countries and had a strong technical skill set and knew
Mm.
that ransomware could enable me to put meaningful amounts of money and food on the table for my family, I
Mm.
might very well engage in those things
Sure.
because
Yeah.
other opportunities might not be available to me.
Mhm.
And so I think that cross cultural empathy and sort of expanding your mindset and exposure to things allowed me to think out of the box more frequently.
Interesting. Yeah.
Um, I don't know. I guess those are probably some of the things that are not in any of my prep notes that I just came up with off the top of
Well,
my.
yeah, no, it's just I would just as a side note, like, so I spent a bunch of my time growing up in other countries, right? So, I lived in, Pakistan and in Thailand and then, West Africa and Sierra Leone, and so, like, growing up there, very similar sort of thing of being able to interact with people in vastly different cultural perspectives. And I think the notion that you just said of sort of cross cultural empathy, or this idea of being able to put yourself in a position that is radically different than your own, or trying to really, you can never really borrow somebody's perspective, but you can value it, and this idea of yeah, not everybody is, in a North American tech job, kind of a thing I think a really interesting takeaway there. I
Yeah.
want to pivot back a little bit. So as you ended up then going in, and so you've co-authored a book on being a CISO as executive and things like this. I'm super curious when you think about if I'm a person who's maybe a director of IT security or a VP of IT security, and I want to make that CISO leap, like
Mhm.
what is the class of things? What are the things that are going to surprise me, you think, given a technical background, that when I go into the C-level suite as a security executive, if I want to be really good at that, what are the things that are going to be like, oh, well, that's a totally bizarre thing that I never thought of, kind of thing?
I think there's probably something to be said about storytelling. Like, you got to be able to help make issues relatable
Yep.
and convey a message in a way that folks can consume, even if they don't understand the technical bits and bytes that you're after. And yeah, using business language is certainly that, and connecting to the values there. But I think in my career, I think after that trip, I came back and I got to see a handful of people at work. And it became clear to me that there were some executives in the cybersecurity space that were true executives, and there were other people that were directors with a title. And I think so. I think about the people like Laz, who was at Sears at the time, and how he told his stories, or Mike Kalak, or Jeff Weeks, or Malcolm Harkins. Like, seeing those guys at work firsthand, in the way
Mhm.
that they led their teams and the way that they talked about their business, was uh I don't know how to say it, but it was materially different. It was like there
Okay.
was something tangibly different about
Yep.
the experience. Like, you would walk out of a sales call with those folks and you're like, "Wow, that
Okay.
was crazy." And then you would go into another thing and you would talk to somebody who was like super frustrated that the idiots above them didn't understand what they were
Yeah.
talking about, and things like that. And
Yeah.
so I think storytelling and communication is probably the biggest. Um and I recognized, I think at that time I was attending a lot of conferences, and even in the intro on the book, actually, I used to go to these conferences, and people at that time were starting to say, you got to speak in the language of the business.
Yeah.
And for me, I would say, okay, well, what's an example of that? Like, how do you do that? Um, and I would go up and ask these guys afterwards, and it became apparent to me that most of them were just in an echo chamber saying that, but they didn't have a slight
Okay.
clue like how you do that. Um, And so I think that's why I say the financial statements. If you can understand how these 3 financial statements tie together,
Mhm.
you can then translate that into the activities in the business, and then you can immediately understand what is it that you're doing that has a direct impact, positive or negative, on the outcomes of the business. So
That makes a ton of sense. I'm kind of curious when you think about that, and you're coming into either you're that VP and you're at a company now. You're working at a company now, and you're thinking about okay, at some point I'd love a a C-suite kind of role. Are there people that you would go talk to? Like, one of the things is we've talked just now about how sales was so eye-opening for you. Like,
mm,
going and talking to the CRO and being like, "Tell me about your job," that sort of stuff. Were there any sorts of, conversations like that that you had early in your career that were super, either useful or memorable to sort of learn some of those business perspectives? Or was it primarily driven by the book study through things like the financial statements?
so when I did my MBA, I was at Crocs. I was at Fishnet and transitioned to Crocs. And I remember, uh, I remember conversations with our head of product. I remember going and talking to this guy Terrence, who was the head of marketing at the time. I talked to the VP, at that point we were just on the inflection point where like e-com started to overtake the sort of retail sales inside of many businesses. And I remember talking to the supply chain guy who had aspirations of COO, and understanding like how had we gone from this complex environment with lasts, which are the little shoe-looking thing that help you form the shoe when you do a mold injection, all the way up to um, uh, the actual machining that took place in Vietnam and Brazil and Mexico and other places. And so yeah, so I was on like a company-wide tour, and I started asking all the questions that I didn't understand through the course of my MBA. And at some point, I think we got a new CEO, and I had watched the earnings call, and I started asking questions. I was asking questions because I wanted to know, like, how do you stitch these things together? How come you stopped reporting this metric? What happened over here in an all hands? It was not the greatest place for me to do this.
Yeah.
And at some point, he sort of went, "Whoa, these are harder questions than the analysts." Uh, I got access to a Bloomberg terminal at that point because I had great conversations with Scott, who was the head of our FP&A team at that point. He later became a CFO. Yeah, man, like for sure, I definitely pulled on those, and I think my biggest partner in roles that followed was to make sure that I understood and became friends with FP&A.
Okay.
Because if I didn't understand the thing about what we were measuring or why or how that impacted value, these are the people that are like literally telling the CFO how these
What's going
modifications are
on? Yeah.
impact the enterprise value, which is in private equity what people actually care about, right?
Well,
Uh, so yeah, I think there was definitely that like tour, but it
yeah.
was on top of the backdrop of I was in a marketing class and learning about the 4 Ps, or I was in a finance class and had just learned about EBITDA or whatever the thing was. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Oh, that makes sense. So, in your current role at Xactly, you've done a tremendous amount of stuff. Like the accomplishments of the team are pretty manifest, and I'm super curious because as we were talking in the run up, you were
Yeah.
sort of mentioning like how proud you are of the accomplishments there. I'm curious, like, talk to me a little bit about the team. Talk to me a little bit about what you guys have done, and like how have you sort of tackled that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think so. I came into exactly. We were on the front end of the financial go to market and product transformation, right? We had already made a couple of M&A acquisitions, and so we had AI in the business already. And I was excited and eager to see sort of how do we accelerate the growth.
Uh,
I reported as to the CFO coming into the org, and I think my first sort of order of business was just to understand like what is the tech stack, how does the business function, who are the key stakeholders, and what is the team? Combination of scaling the team, establishing a center of excellence in India, and then building on top of the Snowflake data lake has been really healthy. We've won awards from CISO magazine and Orbi, and some forthcoming awards from some other folks, which are not public yet. But I think um, beyond just that, the work has been exciting. Like it's been fun. The AI, thing has moved fast, and um, in some ways it's been frustrating because like we're innovating, and at the same time the business is innovating, but the way that they choose to innovate sort of informs what we have to learn, right? So, like, if they choose to use um, a technology, we basically have to learn it, right? If they
sure. Yeah.
pick Databricks or Snowflake or OpenAI or Claude or whatever, like that's what we got to go learn.
Uh,
And so we're in this inherently responsive seat. Um, and so I think at the same time we're building capabilities, and we get to pick the vendors and kind of choose the strategy that we're using there.
mhm.
So, um,
If
yeah,
I
so
can I dive in and ask a question though?
yeah.
Because you're talking about something super fascinating is you're coming in at a transitional time. You're going to build out a center of excellence in India. You're going to scale up the team. You're going to change the technology at the same time, this sort of stuff. And like we mentioned a little bit earlier on that there's like these leadership moments, right? This idea that the like leadership shows up at a time like this, right? And I'm super curious, did you when you were doing this, did you start by as you were, like, leading the team through this transition, did you articulate, like, "Hey, this is where we're going," as sort of like a vision? Did you, like, crowdsource that? How did you end up getting, 15-ish people all pointed in the same direction together with changing the technology at the same time and this kind of thing? Like as a leader, that's a really complex problem. How did you get everybody pointed in the same direction?
I mean, I was lucky in some ways, if I'm honest. Like I hired a fantastic guy as my first hire out in India, and
Okay.
he has just been crushing it.
Okay.
I think um, he complements me in a lot of ways on the soft skill side, and so I think that makes a really powerful
Okay.
team.
Okay.
Think um,
Did
we
you know that sorry, and sorry, and did you know that going in when you hired him? Did you think about it like, "Oh, he's got a skill set that's complementary to mine?"
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we intended to scale as big as we got, the team. Um, so I knew that he had experience managing a 40 or 50 person SOC and globally at Goldman, and I
Mhm.
knew that, of course, as a result of that, like he had strong interpersonal skills,
Yeah.
and that he had a strong understanding of hiring and recruiting and retaining in the India market, which was going to be a skill set that I was going to have to tackle and learn.
Yep.
So I think there was some intentional pieces there, but that there are other things um that he has done phenomenally well that I would have never expected. Like his ability to take ownership and to build cross-functional relationships within the India-based offices and to help us establish a presence there, I think has been really healthy and really powerful in ways that I wouldn't have expected. And we've got other teams like that are scaling in the same office, and we've seen other leaders uh, maybe have less impact.
Okay.
Um, so I think that was lucky. I think we did this exercise called the security team operating system,
Okay.
which was basically looking at values, roles, rhythms, um, uh, I forget the rest. It's a framework that actually Christian Hyatt, who's the CEO and founder of Risk 360,
Okay.
designed and has sort of deployed. So we did one of those exercises early on, and then we've had an executive coach for the last few years that was
Oh,
an executive coach to my CFO and Jason at the time was doing a lot of research into positive psychology and its impact on leadership.
yep.
And so I have to give a lot of credit to the coaching and guidance that we got. Just, interacting and
Mhm.
feeling like whatever frustration or stuck or visibility or whatever. Um, I think all of that played a big role in keeping pace and securing the investments that we needed and creating some alignment. Um, it's not been without friction, right? Like it's a lot of
Sure.
change. So,
Yeah.
um, but I think, yeah, I think there were some pretty intentional investments using the like focused on soft skills.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and the executive coaching I think has certainly been useful for us.
Yeah, super legit. One of the things I'm always fascinated about is like when you get into this level of leadership and you're like, I'm going to scale a team and we're going to transform what we're doing and that sort of stuff. As a technologist, the initial reach is always to like, okay, what tools? Like what is the technology shift we're going to go through, right? But as you think about the leadership, it's like, okay, we've got to build a team that can actually execute on this, and we've got to build an organization that can actually scale this and this sort of stuff. And so like it's this layered problem. So I was fascinated with like what different things people do at different layers, right? Like, is there a team values charter? Did we sit down and do that? And you like, yeah, is your focus on the soft skills? Always seems to be one of those things that differentiates in my mind the places that are really successful because they realize like it's like your team at the end of the day is the thing that will make you successful or not. Like you will swap technology 3 or 4 times, right? But like the team, like if you have the wrong team, like it doesn't really matter. Like I've rare is the technology that can save a bad team, right?
Yeah,
A good team can save a bad technology plenty of times, right? So it's been one at least one of the lessons I've sort of come back with. We are legally obligated to talk a little bit about AI since it's 2026 and it's a Silicon Valley podcast. So from that perspective, I'm super curious. When you think about AI and perhaps AI and cybersecurity,
yeah.
like there's a lot of glooming and dooming, right? Like there's, we've got models that we won't release to anyone because they're terrifying and they're going to come for our children or whatever. And then we've got, advances on defender technologies and AI SOC and stuff like this. Um, what are you looking at? Like, are there things that you're looking at and, with AI that are like particularly interesting or compelling to you, from a cybersecurity standpoint? Like what things are on the horizon that you're like, ooh, that's a really cool, interesting thing, or, oh, that's terrifying. What do you think is on the horizon that's interesting?
Man, well, I mean, I think so. I have to hand it to Vista in this case. Vista drives a lot of forward-looking, forward-thinking approaches inside of the entire portfolio.
Mhm,
So, yeah, so we have been aggressively adopting AI in across the business,
mhm,
including in InfoSec. Um, and so, I think we've done some really interesting things that most CISOs don't talk about. Like we were doing machine learning forecasting on our sales pipeline
mhm.
in order to understand which deals we want to make sure have completed cyber diligence that are high probability and high impact. I don't
Okay.
want to get caught at the end of the quarter, like, Matt, you're the reason we didn't close this deal or whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think some of that is embedded inside of the technology that Xactly is using. But even before Xactly had fully formulated our approach, so we were experimenting with some of that forecasting stuff ourselves.
Oh, wow.
Um, I think there's some stuff on LinkedIn where I talk about us building our own machine learning classifier, not because I thought that we could outperform Sentinel-1 or something
Mhm.
like that, but because we wanted to understand how do you go through the process of model selection and what are the artifacts that are important that you need to protect and what's actually going to create intellectual property and deliver or drive value creation and stuff like that. Um, and then I think, yeah, so we have an AI SOC. We are 24 by 7 with an AI SOC currently.
Mm.
We did early on, as part of that STOS thing, we also partnered with several vendors and said, help us think about how, if we were going to take a jobs to be done approach in InfoSec, what percentage of our overall team could be agentified? And
Okay.
then based on that, we instead of scaling through people, we started to uh, attract the people that were going to help us leverage agents in order to create scale inside of our program. And
Okay.
so that jobs to be done, I think, was relatively forward thinking, um, and helped us establish investments on leveraging natural language processing to support our inbound third party diligence or building AI assistants to help automate responses to sales questionnaires or fully automate the internal audit
IT.
approach so that we can give a functional audit, internal audit to our external auditors, but minimize the expense that we're carrying on our GRC team. Um, I think in the future, if you look
Yep.
forward, what I think will happen is, and I can't say this is my thoughts, but we'll have third party diligence basically by and large negotiated between MCP servers. And
Okay.
then the action points will become the human in the loop, whereas today we have junior level analysts doing a lot of that data
Yeah.
collection and asking all the questions and whatever. I think that's not that far away. Um, we've seen investments in players like CyberGRX and uh, many others where they've built these platforms.
Mhm.
You can get economies of scale and networking effects by assess once, comply many kind of.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that there's a lot of expense without a lot of value delivered to cybersecurity teams and companies in that third party diligence thing. Um, and it would be nice to sort of mitigate a lot of the noise. I think we'll see increased volumes of inquiry around AI bill of materials so that people can understand, like, in tangible ways, what are you actually doing inside of your product? And then how have you overlaid governance processes on top of these AI
Okay.
models?
Mhm.
Um, in order to make sure that, if I give you my data, what are you doing with that data? And how
Yeah.
do who are you giving that data to? I think, um, sub-processor disclosures are certainly part of the storyline, but I think the AI bill of materials disclosures will sort of inform people in a broader way about what kind of technologies at use, and what are the use cases. And I think it'll also empower regulators, and it'll also empower us to be responsive to, the mythos commentary that you made earlier, right? Like what's actually in the software that folks are utilizing to scale these, multi-billion-dollar 10-person companies or whatever's coming in the future, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, just to amplify that, one of the things that's interesting about the perspective that you've taken here is like to think about there's business problems and sort of jobs to be done. And when we think about it that way, one of the things I'm super interested in is if you think about like the thing that Mythos and technologies like it are really doing is they're really banging up against some like intransient things in like patch management basically, right? And it's like one of those things where it's like, okay, like, but our job, like the goal was never to patch quickly. It was to like risk mitigate quickly, right? And so like, do we end up seeing a totally different way to do that kind of management coming out of some of these things? Like, and is it going to shift resources to really investigating some things that have been, problems that have gone on for decades and decades. And now finally, we're going to take a totally different approach because the current solution isn't workable anymore. And I think that's fascinating. Third-party audit as a great example of one of those ones where it's like, yeah, that was a thing that had reached its expiration date, and man, it will be very nice if it's two robots talking to each other with a human overseeing, as opposed to an army of people slinging spreadsheets back and forth. Right, if we can get there. So, well, Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. It's been awesome to talk, and really appreciate your spending the time to visit with us.
Cool. Yeah, appreciate it.